Hello and welcome back to State and Local Government and Politics. In Part 3, we'll discuss models of federalism. Political scientists have developed several ways to describe and study federalism. Rosenthal and Hoffler identify a condensed list of models of American federalism featuring the following core concepts: dual federalism, cooperative federalism, pragmatic federalism, non-centralized federalism, and nation-centered federalism. The U.S. Constitution is an attempt to build a more perfect union between national and state governments. Strengthening the national government provides for a nationwide common market free of tariffs and barriers to commerce. Such a national government could also provide for the common defense more effectively than under the Articles of Confederation. While certain governmental powers were enumerated for the national government, the U.S. Constitution recognizes that state sovereignty should be carefully provided for in law, the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 10th Amendment lays out reserved powers. Based on the 10th Amendment, a provision of the Constitution which holds that all governmental powers not explicitly granted to the national government in the Constitution are reserved to the states and their people. In the American Commonwealth, Lord Bryce noted that even in the post-Civil War period, state sovereignty and the notion of dual federalism, namely two systems fulfilling distinct purposes without any significant overlap in function, continued in the United States. Dual federalism is the concept of federalism positing that the Constitution allows a limited list of powers to the national government, leaving the rest to the sovereign states. Each level of government is dominant within its own sphere, and the Supreme Court serves as the mediator between the national government and the states. In the case Barron v. Baltimore, Maryland, 1830, the U.S. Supreme Court narrowly defined the national government's role in protecting the basic liberties and rights of citizens, leaving to the states and their respective constitutions the lion's share of responsibility in this area of American law. The court ruled that those rights set forth in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, applied to the relationship between the states and the national government, rather than the relationship between citizens and the national government. The dual federalism model survived the Civil War and remained prominent up until the final decades of the 19th century. The emergence of cooperative federalism, the notion that the presence of urgent shared goals required concerted effort by all levels of government, was in part the result of the growth of urbanism and the demise of intimate small communities, large-scale industrialization and rapid population growth through mass migration, and the expansion of the role of the national government as the guarantor of individual rights and liberties. The growth of corporate capitalism led to major excesses in the use of private power to the detriment of the public good and the exploitation of the most disadvantaged. Changes in American society inspired many reformers to press for government regulation in the public interest. Major excesses in the use of private power also in time gave rise to unionization, social regulation, and political reform of machine politics arising from the corruption of public institutions. Cooperative federalism is a concept of federalism where federal, state, and local governments are integrated to act cooperatively, solving common problems rather than making policies separately, but more or less equally or clashing over a policy in a system dominated by the national government. The progressive reformers of this period believed that many of the positive communitarian aspects of American community and society, the obligation to help neighbors in need, reciprocating kindness with a kindness in return, volunteering one's time to civic projects, participating in local governance, and so forth, as described in the historical writings on America penned by the foreign observers Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America and Lord James Bryce were in peril. Progressivism is a political and social term that refers to ideologies and movements favoring or advocating progress, changes, improvement, or reform. Cooperative federalism occurs along a continuum. Top-down models are generally characterized by considerable national government influence in relation to the states. An example of top-down federalism might be seen in the area of environmental policies, which are designed to establish national guidelines for environmental quality for the benefits of all citizens. Conversely, bottom-up federalism often entails innovations originating at the state and local levels that in time reach national-level policy agendas. Welfare reform, for instance, originated at the state level in Wisconsin. Pragmatic federalism was in part born out of the disenchantment with cooperative federalism and is characterized by two unique qualities. First, flexibility. It is outcome-driven rather than process-driven. And second, a downplaying of the philosophy of government, meaning the set of theories about the proper relationship between the national government and state governments, which are of limited interest in this model. When Glendenning and Reeves developed their pragmatic federalism approach in the mid-1980s, it was in response to a growing interest in the centralizing tendencies on the part of American national government, at a time when President Ronald Reagan, a champion of smaller national government, was riding high in the polls. They argued that the concentration of authority in a centralized government structure was a historical trend that would continue, but that the nature of the trend must be considered and shaped in a manner most beneficial to all stakeholder governments and to the public service recipients. Pragmatic federalism ties together three very important phenomena. First, it argues for greater reliance on informal relationships between policy actors who are guided by circumstances rather than organizational structure. Second, it favors movement towards proactive street-level policymaking and analysis whenever possible. And finally, it identifies a growing trend towards public-private partnerships in solving problems and a shared governance movement playing an important role in shaping an innovative approach to thinking about American federalism. The decline of the cooperative federalism model was fueled in part by significant changes to methods of funding programs. Funding in the form of grants and aid emanating from the national level to meet program goals was increasingly made in the form of block grants, revenue transfers, which gave state and local governments considerable flexibility in determining specific policy goals and methods of meeting those goals. Non-centralized models of federalism can be traced to growing skepticism over the dominant role of Congress and the national government in intergovernmental relationships. Non-centralized federalism looks to analysis and community-based approaches for understanding federalism. Working from the premise that strong democracy relies most immediately on stalwart local communities and robust public and/or private institutions, some advocates for non-centralized federalism argue for a more individual-focused approach through collective decision-making built on the principles of communitarianism. Communitarianism is a political philosophy emphasizing the need to balance individual rights and interests with that of the community, positing that individuals are shaped by the culture and values of their communities. Other advocates for non-centralized federalism argue for a more individual-focused approach, relying on the individual consumer acting to solve his or her own dilemmas. This approach is often built on classical liberalism, which emphasizes a limited role for government. Classical liberalism is a political philosophy placing a high value on individual freedom based on a belief in natural rights that exist independent of government. Nation-centered federalism has also been called permissive federalism. This model implies that there is a sharing of power and authority between the national and state governments, but the state's share rests upon the permission and permissiveness of the national government. Not all communities possess equal capacity for extensive citizen participation. Over the decades, in some cases, political and social traditions slowly evolve, producing norms of participation and views about the role of citizens, government, and the interchange between the two. These different traditions become part of the political culture. Political culture are the attitudes, values, and beliefs about a political system. Three major categories of political and social relationships have been identified: individualistic, moralistic, and traditionalistic. Individualistic political culture. Problems are seen in terms of individual solutions. Communal solutions are not highly valued. This school of thought emphasizes the conception of the democratic order as a marketplace, in which government is instituted for strictly utilitarian reasons to handle those functions demanded by the people it is created to serve. Moralistic political culture. Problems are seen in terms of community dilemmas that must be identified through interchange and community choice. This school of thought emphasizes the Commonwealth conception as the basis for democratic government, whose responsibility it is to promote the general welfare. And traditionalistic political culture. The school of thought that accepts government as an actor with a positive role in the community, but limiting that role to securing the continued maintenance of the existing social order. In this system, political parties are not important, but rather political competition is expressed through factions, an extension of the personal politics characteristic of the system, although not necessarily for direct pecuniary gain. In Part 4, we will discuss 21st century network approaches to federalism.